The perfect crime. It is the ultimate goal of every killer. To commit a murder so flawlessly that the police are fooled, the family is pacified, and the law never even suspects a thing. In the winter of 1897, a man named Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue, who went by the name Edward, thought he had committed the perfect crime. He had murdered his young wife in their home, manipulated the local doctor into declaring it a natural death, and buried her body deep in the frozen ground. He had covered his tracks completely. There were no witnesses. There was no murder weapon. The case was closed. Edward Shue had gotten away with murder. But Edward made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot that the dead do not always rest in peace. What you are about to hear is not an urban legend. It is not a spooky campfire story. It is a documented historical event. It is the only known case in the history of the United States legal system where the testimony of a ghost was accepted in a court of law to convict a murderer. There is a state historical marker standing in West Virginia today that officially recognizes this impossible event. This is the chilling, true story of the Greenbrier Ghost. Our story begins in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. It is a beautiful, rugged area wrapped in the Appalachian Mountains. In the late 1800s, it was a quiet, tight-knit farming community where everyone knew everyone else's business. Zona Heaster was a beautiful 23-year-old woman living in the county. She was known to be bright, cheerful, and the absolute light of her mother's life. Her mother, Mary Jane Heaster, was a tough, fiercely protective Appalachian woman. In the fall of 1896, a stranger came to town. His name was Edward Shue. He was a blacksmith, a handsome, charming, and broad-shouldered man. When Edward met Zona, he turned on the charm. He was entirely focused on her. It was a whirlwind romance. But Zona's mother, Mary Jane, hated Edward from the moment she laid eyes on him. She could not explain it, but she felt a dark, heavy presence whenever he was in the room. She warned her daughter that this man was dangerous. She begged Zona not to marry him. But Zona was young and in love. Ignoring her mother's desperate warnings, Zona and Edward were married in late 1896. They moved into a small, isolated house that doubled as Edward's blacksmith shop. For a few short months, everything seemed normal. But behind closed doors, the charm was fading, and the monster was waking up. On the bitterly cold morning of January 23, 1897, Edward Shue went to work at his blacksmith shop. A few hours later, he asked a young neighborhood boy who was running errands to go to his house and ask Zona if she needed anything from the store. The young boy walked up to the Shue residence. He knocked on the door. There was no answer. He opened the door and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. The boy called out for Zona. He walked into the living room, and his blood ran cold. There, lying at the bottom of the staircase, was Zona. She was stretched out, perfectly straight. One hand was resting on her stomach. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. She was dead. The boy ran out of the house, screaming, and fetched the local physician and coroner, Dr. George Knapp. But by the time Dr. Knapp arrived at the house, something very strange had already happened. Edward Shue had beaten the doctor to the scene, and instead of leaving the body where it fell, as was customary, Edward had moved his dead wife. He had carried her upstairs and laid her on the bed. But he had done more than just move her. Edward had dressed the corpse himself. This was entirely against the tradition of the time. Usually, the women of the community would wash and dress a female body for burial. But Edward had taken it upon himself to dress Zona in a very specific, high-necked, stiff-collared dress. He had also tied a large, heavy veil around her neck and face. When Dr. Knapp entered the bedroom to examine the body, Edward was sitting on the edge of the bed. He was crying hysterically, cradling Zona's head and neck in his arms. The doctor approached to begin his examination, but the moment Dr. Knapp tried to look at Zona's neck, Edward snapped. His grief instantly turned to violent rage. He screamed at the doctor, threatening him, and holding his dead wife's head tightly against his chest. Dr. Knapp was intimidated. Edward was a massive, strong blacksmith. Not wanting a physical altercation, he simply backed away. He had only been able to examine Zona's chest and abdomen because he couldn't do a full autopsy, and because Zona had been complaining of feeling faint a few weeks prior. Dr. Knapp officially listed the cause of death as an everlasting faint, which he later changed to complications from childbirth, even though it was not known for sure if she was pregnant. The body was released to the family for burial. Mary Jane Heaster, Zona's mother, was inconsolable, but beneath her grief, a dark, terrible suspicion was brewing. She knew her daughter had not died of a faint. She knew, with every fiber of a mother's intuition, that Edward Shue had murdered her. But she had absolutely no proof. During the wake, which was held at the mother's house, Edward's behavior grew even more bizarre and disturbing. He never left the casket. He paced back and forth, staring at anyone who came near. He had placed a folded towel along one side of Zona's head and a large pillow on the other side. When people asked why, Edward smoothly claimed that it would help her rest easier. He also tied a large, thick scarf around her neck. He told the mourners that it was Zona's favorite scarf, and she would have wanted to be buried in it. Whenever anyone tried to look closely at Zona's face, Edward would become aggressive and physically block them. Mary Jane watched all of this from the corner of the room. She noticed the scarf. She noticed the pillows propping up her daughter's head. She noticed how floppy and loose Zona's head seemed when Edward moved the casket. But before she could demand answers, the funeral was over. Zona was buried in the cold earth of the local cemetery. Edward Shue walked away, a free man. The town moved on. The perfect crime was complete. But Mary Jane Heaster could not move on. She was consumed by the injustice of it all. She began to pray. She prayed every single day and every single night. She prayed not for peace, but for the truth. She prayed that if her daughter was murdered, she would be allowed to return from the grave and tell her exactly what happened. For 4 weeks, there was nothing but silence, and then the nights grew colder. Mary Jane was sleeping in her bedroom when a sudden, freezing chill woke her up. The room was unnaturally cold. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to be moving. Slowly, the darkness began to pull itself together. It formed a shape, a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was Zona, but she was not the beautiful, vibrant girl she had been in life. She was pale, glowing with an unnatural, sickly light. Mary Jane was terrified, but she could not look away. The ghost of Zona did not speak that first night. She simply stood there, staring at her mother with hollow, sorrowful eyes, before slowly fading away into the dark. The next night, Mary Jane waited. She did not sleep, and once again, the temperature dropped. The air grew heavy, and Zona appeared. This time, the ghost spoke. Her voice was described as sounding like the winter wind, hollow, distant, and filled with pain. She told her mother that Edward was not the man he pretended to be. She said he was a monster. He had beaten her constantly. He had kept her isolated and terrified. On the third night, the ghost returned again, and this time she revealed exactly how she died. Zona's spirit told her mother that on the morning of January 23rd, Edward had flown into a violent, uncontrollable rage. The reason he was angry that Zona had not cooked meat for his dinner. He attacked her. He grabbed her by the throat. And then the ghost of Zona did something that burned itself into Mary Jane's memory forever. To prove what happened, the glowing apparition of Zona stared directly into her mother's eyes, reached up with her transparent hands and grabbed her own head. And then she slowly turned her head completely around. A full 360 degrees. The ghost whispered, "He broke my neck at the first joint." After the fourth night of these terrifying visitations, Mary Jane Heaster had heard enough. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was a woman armed with the testimony of the dead. She marched straight into the office of the local prosecuting attorney, a man named John Preston. John Preston was a man of law, a man of science and facts. When this elderly mountain woman sat in his office and told him that the ghost of her dead daughter had visited her for 4 nights and accused her husband of murder. Preston thought she had lost her mind from grief. He gently told her that he could not open a murder investigation based on a dream. He told her there was no physical evidence, but Mary Jane was relentless. She described the exact detail the ghost had given her. The neck was broken at the first joint. She described Edward's bizarre behavior with the pillows, the stiff collar, and the scarf at the funeral. She demanded an exhumation. Preston was skeptical, but as a good prosecutor, he decided to look into the circumstantial evidence. He spoke to the people who attended the funeral. They all confirmed Edward's strange, aggressive behavior around the coffin. He spoke to Dr. Knapp, who admitted that he had not been able to examine the neck because Edward had violently prevented it. The circumstantial evidence was too strange to ignore. Despite the bizarre source of the information, Prosecutor Preston ordered the grave of Zona Heaster to be dug up. When Edward Shue heard that they were exhuming his wife's body, he panicked. He furiously complained to anyone who would listen. He said they were violating her rest. He even told a neighbor, "They will not be able to prove I did it." A very strange choice of words for an innocent man. On a cold day in late February, Zona's coffin was pulled from the frozen earth. Her body was taken to the local schoolhouse, which was temporarily turned into a morgue. Dr. Knapp, along with 2 other physicians, prepared to do a full, proper autopsy. Edward Shue was forced to attend. He stood in the corner of the room, sweating profusely, whittling a stick with a pocket knife to try and hide his trembling hands. The doctors carefully removed the heavy veil and the stiff collar that Edward had dressed Zona in. They looked at her neck. The skin on the throat was deeply bruised, showing the clear, dark marks of a man's thick fingers. They gently lifted her head. It was completely loose. It flopped to the side with no resistance whatsoever. The doctors performed the internal examination. The official medical report read as follows. The windpipe was crushed. On the back of the neck, the ligaments were torn and ruptured, and the neck was completely broken. Where was it broken? Exactly at the first joint, just as the ghost had said. Edward Shue was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial of Edward Shue was a media sensation. Reporters from all over the country traveled to the small town in West Virginia. The evidence against Edward was entirely circumstantial. There were no witnesses to the actual murder. All the prosecution had was the fact that the neck was broken, and Edward had acted suspiciously. Prosecutor Preston was a smart man. He knew that if he brought a ghost story into a courtroom, the jury would laugh the case out the door. He strictly instructed his team not to mention the ghostly visitations. He focused entirely on the medical evidence, the broken neck, and Edward's violent behavior at the funeral. The defense attorney for Edward Shue was a man named William Rucker. He knew the circumstantial evidence looked bad for his client. He needed a way to make the prosecution's star witness, Mary Jane Heaster, look completely insane. Rucker knew the rumor going around town. He knew about the ghost. So, when Mary Jane took the witness stand, the defense attorney made the biggest mistake of his career. He broke the golden rule of law. Never ask a question you don't know the answer to. Hoping to discredit her in front of the jury, Rucker aggressively questioned Mary Jane about her visions. He sneered at her and asked, "I hear you have been talking to the dead, Mrs. Heaster. Tell the jury, did your daughter's ghost really tell you her neck was broken?" Rucker expected Mary Jane to stumble. He expected her to sound crazy. Instead, Mary Jane sat up perfectly straight. She looked the defense attorney dead in the eyes, completely unshaken. She answered, "Yes, she came to me 4 times. It was not a dream. She was standing right there. And she told me that the man sitting right there." She pointed a trembling finger at Edward, broke her neck at the first joint. Rucker tried to trap her. He asked her if she was asleep. He asked if it was the devil tricking her. He spent an hour trying to break her testimony. But Mary Jane never wavered. Her absolute, unwavering conviction, her calm demeanor, and the terrifying detail of her story completely captivated the courtroom. The judge allowed the testimony to stay on the record. The defense had accidentally introduced the ghost's testimony into the official court transcript. When the trial concluded, the judge instructed the jury. They deliberated for only an hour and 10 minutes. The jury returned to the courtroom. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of murder in the 1st degree. Edward Shue was sentenced to life in the West Virginia State Penitentiary. 3 years later, in 1900, he died in prison of an unknown illness. He took his secrets to the grave. Following the trial, investigators looked into Edward Shue's past. What they found proved that the ghost of Zona had every reason to come back. Zona was not Edward's first wife. She was his third. His first wife had divorced him due to extreme physical abuse. His second wife had died under highly mysterious circumstances. She was found dead with a massive head wound. Edward claimed she had accidentally fallen and hit her head on a rock, but there were no rocks where she fell. He had gotten away with it. He thought he could get away with it a third time, and he would have, if it weren't for a mother's relentless prayer and a spirit that refused to be silenced. Today, as you drive through Greenbrier County on Route 60, you will see a bronze historical marker on the side of the road. It briefly tells the story of Zona Heaster Shue. It stands as an official state recognition that sometimes the justice system gets a little help from the other side. We live in a world of DNA evidence, surveillance cameras, and forensic science. We like to believe that everything can be explained logically. But the Greenbrier Ghost forces us to ask a terrifying question. When a crime is so horrific, when a secret is so dark that the living cannot uncover it, does the universe have a way of balancing the scales? Is there a line between life and death that can be crossed when justice demands it? Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most impossible true stories. I want to hear from you. Do you believe Mary Jane Heaster truly saw the ghost of her murdered daughter? Or was it just a mother's subconscious intuition guiding her to the truth? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. If you want more untold true mysteries, hit that subscribe button, turn off the lights, and I will see you in the next story.